I've always liked the quiet of the road. No one asking questions, no one poking into your business, just miles of highway, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of a distant voice on the CB. But that night, somewhere on Route 50 in the middle of Nevada, the silence felt different. Too quiet, too heavy. It had been days since I'd had a decent break. I'd left San Francisco with a load of building materials bound for Kansas City, figuring Route 50 would cut the travel time. They call it the loneliest road in America, and I've driven it enough times to know why. For hours at a time, you don't see a soul. Just endless desert dotted with mountains that never seem to get any closer. I was more tired than I wanted to admit. The kind of tired that sneaks up on you, where your eyelids grow heavy and the lines on the road start to blur. Normally, I'd push through, but something told me to pull over this time. I glanced at the clock and decided to hit the next rest stop I saw. A quick nap, I told myself, and I'd be good as new. Relief washed over me when I spotted the weathered sign for a rest stop 2 miles ahead. The stop wasn't marked on my map, which was odd. But these old highways have plenty of places that don't show up anymore. The place looked like it hadn't seen a decent coat of paint in a decade. The lights above the parking area flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A beat-up picnic table and a few rusted trash bins were all that marked the stop. The restroom building sat off to the side, its windows dark, and the air around it felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I pulled the rig into the lot and killed the engine. Silence settled around me, pressing through the windows. Leaning back in the driver's seat, I rubbed my face. I just needed a few hours of sleep, and I'd be good to go. But before I could settle in, nature called. Typical. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The night air was cold, much colder than I'd expected for Nevada, and the wind carried a strange scent, dry with an underlying hint of something rotten. I wrinkled my nose but kept moving toward the restroom. The building was worse up close. Graffiti covered the exterior, but it wasn't the usual stuff. No names or crude drawings. These were symbols, spirals, triangles, strange geometric shapes I couldn't quite place. Some of them were carved deep into the wood, like they'd been there a long time. I pushed the door open, and the smell inside hit me even harder, stronger than before. I flicked the light on, but the bulb overhead just buzzed and flickered weakly. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. The place was empty, as I expected, but the walls were covered in more of those symbols, dozens of them carved into the tiles, drawn on the mirrors. I did my business quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that those symbols were watching me, and made my way back out to the parking lot. That's when I saw the first figure. It stood just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. A man in a heavy coat, his back to me, staring out into the desert. For a second, I considered calling out to him, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so quiet, made my gut twist. I stopped in my tracks, debating whether I should just get back in the truck and go. But the man didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. Maybe he was just another trucker, but I hadn't seen another rig on the road in hours. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping an eye on the figure. When I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushed against something cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back, confused, and shone the flashlight on the handle. Symbols. Those same spirals and triangles were scratched into the metal of my door. My heart started racing. I hadn't seen them there before. I would have noticed. I swallowed hard, scanning the lot, but the figure was gone, just vanished. I fumbled with the door, pulling it open and climbing back into the cab as fast as I could. I locked the doors and sat there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had driven across the country dozens of times, stopped at every kind of rundown, creepy rest stop imaginable, but nothing like this. The radio crackled to life suddenly, nearly making me jump out of my skin. For a second, I thought it was just picking up static, but then a voice broke through, low, distorted. Frank. My heart skipped a beat. I snatched the CB mic. Who is this? Silence. I stared at the radio, waiting, but the voice didn't come back. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound of my name, it was too clear. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man in the coat, but the lot was empty. The only movement was the weak flicker of the overhead lights. Still, that rotten smell lingered, hanging in the air like a warning. I was about to start the engine and get the hell out of there when I noticed something in the rear-view mirror. There was another figure now, standing near the restrooms. This one was closer. I couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but they were staring right at me, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but when I reached for the ignition, the engine sputtered and died before it could even turn over. I tried again. Nothing. The lights on the dashboard flickered weakly before going out altogether. "Come on," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Don't do this to me now." I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal, no bars, no nothing. The figure was still there, closer now. Another figure appeared near the picnic table, and then another by the trash bins. They didn't approach, but they were closing in, little by little. My mouth was dry. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the restroom, hoping to get a better look at the figures. The beam of light cut through the dark, but when it hit the first figure, they were gone, just gone. I swept the light across the lot, but all the figures had disappeared, every single one. I didn't waste any more time. If my truck wasn't going to start, I'd fix it in the morning. For now, I just needed to get out of here on foot if I had to. I grabbed the toolbox from under the seat, just in case, and jumped down from the cab. That's when I noticed something else on the side of my truck. Etched into the paint was one of those symbols, fresh. I could smell the metallic tang of scratched metal. It was the same spirals and triangles I'd seen in the bathroom, the same ones that had been on the door handle. The smell hit me again, stronger now. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the restroom, and that's when I saw it. The symbols were glowing. A faint, sickly light pulsed from the walls of the building. The carvings and scratches were now alive with some kind of energy. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low hum building in my chest. I stumbled back toward the truck, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but the lights in the building grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the lot. And then I heard the voice again. Frank. I whipped around, scanning the empty lot, but there was no one there. No figures, no man in the coat. Just the voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Frank, you need to stay." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept moving, trying to get back into the cab. But the symbols, they were on my truck now, glowing with the same eerie light. The handle felt like ice under my fingers. The wind picked up, howling across the lot, carrying whispers with it. Low, urgent voices layered on top of each other, impossible to understand, but they felt old. Ancient. I was frozen in place, trapped between the truck and whatever the hell was happening in that restroom. The lights, the symbols, the voices, I didn't know what to make of any of it, but I knew one thing. I had to leave. Now. The truck groaned as I climbed back into the cab, and I turned the key one last time, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. Without another thought, I slammed the truck into gear and floored it out of the lot, the tires skidding on the cracked asphalt. The rest stop disappeared in the rearview mirror, the glowing lights and symbols fading into the distance. As I drove down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The silence of the road was back, but it wasn't the same. The weight of those symbols, the voice, it lingered. And I knew, deep down, that whatever was tied to that rest stop wasn't finished with me. I don't stop on Route 50 anymore, not after that night. Some places are better left in the past. You get used to the rhythm of the road after a while. The hum of the engine beneath you, the steady pull of the truck, the highway stretching out like a never-ending ribbon. It's a kind of solitude I've come to appreciate over the years. I'm Ben Grady, though most folks call me Bear on account of my size, and I've been behind the wheel for a long time. Trucking is simple. You pick up a load, drop it off, and keep moving. That's what I liked about it. But this job was different from the start. I picked up the trailer in Chicago. The client was a slick, suited guy, one of those corporate types. He barely even looked at me as he handed over the papers. "Keep the trailer locked," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. No stops, no questions. I should have known something was off. The pay was double the usual rate, too good for a straightforward haul across I-80 to Salt Lake City. But I was behind on bills, and after the divorce, well, you don't say no to easy money. Now, somewhere between Kearney and North Platte, Nebraska, in the dead of night, that easy money was starting to feel like blood money. The road was empty, save for the occasional distant glow of farmhouses. Otherwise, it was just me, my rig, and miles of flat highway, nothing but darkness ahead and behind. My truck's headlights cut through the night, illuminating the white lines on the road, but something about the blackness beyond felt heavier than usual, like it was waiting. I tried not to think too hard about it, just keep driving, get to Salt Lake, drop the load, and forget about it. Simple. But then the first strange thing happened. The truck's temperature gauge started going haywire, flipping between cold and hot so fast I thought it was broken. First, the cab was freezing, then it was sweltering, all within minutes. I pulled over onto the shoulder, popped the hood, and checked the engine. Everything looked fine. I chalked it up to a glitch in the electronics. These rigs are built to last, but every now and then something acts up. Satisfied I wasn't about to fry the engine, I climbed back in. But as I settled into the driver's seat, I heard it, a soft thump from the trailer. I froze, my hand halfway to the ignition. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. Something had moved in the back. I forced myself to breathe slowly. It's nothing, probably just the cargo shifting. Hell, I didn't even know what was in there. But heavy loads can settle like that. Still, a knot twisted in my gut. It was too quiet, too deliberate. For a second, I thought about checking the trailer, but the client's voice echoed in my mind. Keep it locked. No stops, no questions. Fine, I wasn't going to ask any questions, and I sure as hell wasn't going to break the lock. I fired up the engine and got back on the road, but the tension lingered. The temperature gauge flickered again. I adjusted the air vents, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. A few miles down the highway, the radio crackled to life. I nearly jumped out of my seat. "Ben," a voice whispered through the static. I stared at the CB, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard another trucker's voice all night. The road was dead empty. But the voice on the radio, it wasn't a trucker. It was my voice. I grabbed the mic, my knuckles white around it. "Who the hell is this?" The static fizzled, then came back stronger, hissing and popping in my ears. "Ben, you need to stop." I dropped the mic like it was burning my hand, cursing under my breath. It had to be a prank. Someone messing around on the frequency, maybe picking up my name from a previous broadcast. But that didn't make sense. The only chatter I'd had was hours ago, and I hadn't said much more than where I was heading. As I stared at the radio, a chill crawled over me. Then the trailer thumped again, louder this time. I jerked my eyes to the side mirror, half expecting to see something clawing its way out of the trailer. But all I saw was the dark outline of the rig behind me, its taillights glowing faintly in the blackness. Another thump, followed by a low scratching sound, like nails on metal. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I was getting out and checking the damn thing. To hell with the lock. Maybe the cargo had shifted. Maybe there was an animal in there. I didn't care. I just needed to know. I pulled over again, this time in the middle of nowhere. The road was surrounded by nothing but fields and distant silos. I climbed out of the cab, the cold night air biting at my skin, and grabbed the key from my pocket. As I approached the back of the trailer, the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Whatever was in there, it was alive. I unlocked the heavy padlock, my heart pounding in my ears, and swung open the doors. The smell hit me first, not the musty scent of old cargo, but something far worse. A stench of decay, like something rotten in the dark. My stomach churned, but I lifted my flashlight and pointed it inside. For a moment, I thought the trailer was empty, but then I saw it. At the far end of the trailer, hunched in the shadows, was a figure. It was humanoid but twisted, like its body had been mangled and warped. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and slick, almost translucent. The thing was huddled against the wall, its back to me, but I could hear it breathing, shallow and rapid. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping back, the beam of my flashlight shaking. The thing turned its face, if you could call it that. It was a mess of raw red flesh, its eyes sunken deep into its skull, staring at me with a mix of hunger and desperation. Its mouth opened into a wet, gaping maw, and a low, guttural hiss escaped its throat. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were frozen in place. The creature moved, its elongated limbs unfolding as it dragged itself toward me. Each step was punctuated by the sickening sound of its flesh scraping against the metal floor. I didn't think. I just slammed the trailer door shut and fumbled with the lock. My fingers trembled so badly I could barely secure it. The thing inside let out a shriek, a sound so unnatural, so piercing, it felt like it was burrowing into my skull. I stumbled back to the cab, my legs shaking beneath me, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell had I just seen? What had they put in my truck? I knew I couldn't stay parked on the side of the road, not with whatever that thing was still inside. I had to move, had to get away. But I also knew I couldn't drive that thing to Salt Lake. No way. Whatever was in the back of my trailer, it wasn't going to make it to its destination. I grabbed the CB mic again, my hand shaking. "This is Ben Grady." I hesitated, glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see the creature clawing its way out. "I need help. There's something in my trailer." Static. Then, through the crackling noise, I heard it again. "Ben, you need to stop." My voice, clearer this time, like it was coming from right beside me. I slammed the mic down, shifted into gear, and pulled back onto the road. I didn't know where I was going anymore, just away. Away from that thing, away from whatever nightmare I had gotten myself into. As I sped down the highway, the temperature gauge flickered again, this time dropping into the red. The cab grew colder. My breath was visible in the air, and I could hear the trailer groaning behind me. The thing inside was still moving, still scratching, still trying to get out. The radio crackled one last time. "Ben, it's too late." I glanced at the dashboard. Every light was blinking. The engine sputtered as the temperature dropped even lower. I could feel the rig slowing, like the weight of the trailer was dragging it down, like whatever was inside was getting heavier by the second. And then the truck stopped dead in the middle of the highway. The engine cut out. The lights flickered before plunging me into complete darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The only sound was the soft, steady scratching from the trailer behind me. The door handle rattled. Something pressed against the cab from the outside, its weight heavy enough to rock the truck. I didn't turn. I didn't want to see what was trying to get in, but I knew it wouldn't be long before the door opened. That's the last thing I remember. When they found me the next morning, the rig was empty. No sign of the trailer, no sign of the cargo. Just me, sitting in the cab, frozen stiff, my breath still fogging in the cold morning air. I never asked what happened to the trailer. Some things are better left locked away. When I finally got back on Route 2, the radio was silent. No static, no voices, just the empty road and the stars overhead. I never did figure out what happened that night. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. But I know one thing. I don't drive that stretch of road anymore. Whatever was out there, whatever was calling me to that place, is something best left alone. Some things, once you hear them, never stop echoing. I've always believed that everything has an explanation. Ghost stories, strange occurrences, they're all just misinterpretations of reality. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV deep into the desert, chasing the Marfa lights, one of those unexplained phenomena people love to whisper about. I was determined to demystify them, capture them on camera, and prove to the world that there was nothing supernatural about them. The desert stretched out before me, flat and endless, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. I had parked my RV on the outskirts of Marfa, Texas, far enough from town to avoid any distractions. The lights were supposed to appear at night, floating out there in the desert like glowing orbs. People called them spirits or even UFOs, but I knew better. I was here to photograph them, document them, and move on. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I set up my camera gear just outside the RV, tripods locked in place, lenses ready for long exposure shots. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've been buried under a blanket. No wind, no animals, not even the hum of distant cars. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the wild before. This was nothing new. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up and call it a night, the lights appeared. At first they were faint, barely noticeable, small glowing orbs hovering just above the horizon. I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on them. They weren't anything special, just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought. But then they moved, slowly, almost deliberately. They floated closer, their soft glow reflecting off the desert sand. I snapped photo after photo, my fingers flying over the camera buttons. This was exactly what I'd come for. Clear, undeniable evidence. No one could call this supernatural nonsense once I had the data. But the lights were behaving differently than I expected. They weren't just floating randomly, they were almost watching me. I stood up, staring at the lights as they hovered, flickering softly, maybe 50 yards away. Then, suddenly, they darted closer. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively stepped back. The lights pulsed, brightening for a moment before retreating, as if they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Just lights, just gases or atmospheric anomalies, nothing to be afraid of. But the way they moved, it was as if they were alive. I shook my head, frustrated. "Focus, Greg. It's all explainable," I muttered to myself. I turned back to my camera gear, checking the shots I had taken. That's when the first problem started. The images were completely corrupted. Every shot I had taken of the lights was ruined, nothing but distorted lines and static, like an old TV losing signal. I flipped through the photos in disbelief. The lights had been right there, clear as day, yet my camera had failed to capture a single usable image. My stomach churned. That wasn't right. I had tested all the equipment before I left. I had checked the camera, adjusted the settings, but the battery was draining too fast. The indicator flashed red, and within seconds the camera died in my hands. "Damn it," I hissed, grabbing my backup battery, but it was no use. Everything, camera, spare batteries, even my phone, was losing power faster than it should. It was as if something was draining the life out of my equipment. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried not to think about the lights still hovering outside, flickering just beyond the window. It had to be a glitch, I told myself. I'd deal with it in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, expecting to see the light still hovering there. I didn't want to admit it, but something about them unnerved me. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent hours checking my gear, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but everything looked fine. The equipment was fully functional again, as if nothing had happened. It was strange, but I wasn't about to let one weird night stop me. I'd try again tonight, capture the lights properly this time. As evening fell, I set up my gear again, determined to make up for last night. The desert was still, the sky a dull orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched, waiting for the lights to appear, and they did. But this time, they were closer. They floated just above the sand, pulsing softly, glowing brighter than before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move. Their rhythm was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just their movement that startled me. It was the fact that they seemed to be getting closer. I reached for my camera, ready to capture them again, but the battery was dead. Again. I checked my phone. Dead. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind. This wasn't possible. The lights were now just 30 feet away, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. They pulsed brighter, flickering in strange, almost deliberate patterns. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were trying to communicate. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing past my ear. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. Greg. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the empty desert. The whisper came again, closer this time. Greg. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't explainable. The lights were hovering just a few feet away now, and the whispers, they were inside my head. I scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights were outside the window, pulsing, flickering. The whispering continued, filling the small space with eerie, disembodied voices. I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power, no escape. The lights pressed closer, their glow filling the RV, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt them, those whispers, crawling into my mind, telling me to come outside, to follow them into the desert. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let this beat me. I wasn't going to give in to fear. But then the lights began to move. They circled the RV faster and faster, as if they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Follow. Follow the lights. I felt a tug, a pull in my chest, as if the lights were calling me, drawing me out of the RV. I fought against it, but it was getting harder to resist. The lights flickered faster, the whispers filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my jacket, flipping off, kicked the door open, and ran into the desert. The lights followed, darting around me, leading me deeper into the night. I stumbled through the sand, my heart pounding. The whispers guided me further from the RV, but something inside me snapped. I stopped running, gasping for air, and turned to face the lights. I wasn't going to follow them. I wasn't going to disappear like so many before me. No, I shouted, my voice trembling. I won't go. The lights pulsed, flickering faster. The whispers screamed in my head, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to ignore them. Slowly, the lights began to fade. The whispers grew softer until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the wind. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted, my mind spinning. The lights were gone, retreating into the desert, but I knew they'd be back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I packed up and left Marfa. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the desert, far from the lights. I never told anyone what happened. No one would believe me anyway. But I'll never forget those lights, the way they moved, the way they whispered my name. I came here to prove they were just a natural phenomenon, just an unexplained mystery of the desert. But now I know better. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some lights should never be followed. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last. But something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70 heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive, needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister, bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter, Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. Cutting the engine, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit struggling, stuttering as if it were fighting off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was met with a gust of frigid air. The smell was wrong, cold metal mixed with something decayed, the kind of stench that clings to your nose and won't let go. I shined my light into the trailer, scanning for the source of the problem. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping. No, not tapping, scratching. It was coming from the crate. A large wooden crate sat strapped down in the center of the trailer, wrapped in heavy chains. My heart pounded, adrenaline spiking in a way that screamed at me to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching grew louder. The crate shifted, just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping back. I wasn't going to open it, not in a million years. Slamming the trailer door shut, I locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe. Whatever was inside that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B. No questions asked. Climbing back into the cab, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, convincing myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, some kind of government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, making me jump in my seat. Static filled the cab, and then through the fuzz I heard something faint, a voice, a woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. At first, I thought they were just shadows, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again. Then came the knocking. Loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, as if it were pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse as if it were alive, breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirled in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand, but one voice stood out, one voice I knew. Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I had seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I had ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I saw them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar, faces I had seen on the road before, long-dead truckers' friends. Then, as if the storm itself had parted, I saw her, Carol, standing in the middle of the road. Her white dress billowed in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it slid across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm had passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone, no signal, no way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again, Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face was pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions, but there I was, driving deeper into Ford Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore, vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The farther I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but now a dense fog was rolling in, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a grey blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I had driven on was no longer showing up on the map. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I had just come down it, but now on the map it was nowhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I had driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, my heart racing now. Grabbing my flashlight, I marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, my heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. Hello? My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I had missed a turn somewhere. That was all, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, so I cranked up the RV's heater and wrapped myself in blankets. sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds, like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I didn't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I had taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story, it was real, and I wasn't getting out. I parked my RV deep in the Black Hills, farther than I had ever dared to go before. The last sign of civilization had been a gas station over an hour back, and now it was just me, the trees, and the silence. And that was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. After the divorce, I craved it like a drug. I needed this trip to remind myself of who I used to be, before the arguments, before the failures, before the loneliness settled in like a slow-burning rot. Out here, surrounded by miles of forest, I would find peace. At least, that was what I told myself as I killed the engine, the sudden quiet swallowing me whole. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, breathing in the sharp, cold air. The Black Hills were breathtaking, tall, ancient pines rising like sentinels against the darkening sky. The wind was still, not even a rustle of leaves, just silence. I walked around the clearing, feeling the weight of the world lift ever so slightly with each step. This was why I loved the wilderness, the isolation, the escape. But there was something off this time, a heaviness in the air. I had been here before, years ago, but it had never felt like this. I shook off the feeling. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had been a rough few months and I wasn't thinking straight. A couple of nights out here would fix that. I busied myself with setting up camp, though there wasn't much to do. The RV had everything I needed. I lit a fire outside anyway, for old time's sake, and poured myself a drink. I sat on the fold-out chair and stared into the flames, letting the warmth pull me in. Then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like tapping. I looked around, but there was nothing, probably just the forest settling. I turned back to the fire, trying to relax, but the noise came again, rhythmic, deliberate this time. I couldn't shake it off. Animals, I muttered to myself, standing up and shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. I scanned the edge of the forest, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing tall, unmoving. I took a deep breath and laughed. I was being paranoid. The first night alone always did this to me, made me jump at shadows. I headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night I slept fitfully. Dreams of my ex-wife drifted through my mind, her face twisted in anger, her voice echoing in that same sharp, accusing tone I knew too well. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. By morning, the feeling of unease still clung to me like a damp fog. I tried to ignore it, pushing myself to enjoy the day. I spent the morning hiking, trying to lose myself in the familiar sights of the Black Hills, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt off, too quiet, too still. I returned to the RV just after midday, planning to settle in and enjoy a lazy afternoon. That's when the real problems began. The generator sputtered and died as I tried to start it up. I cursed, fiddling with the switch, but nothing happened. No power, no lights, and no heat. I wasn't worried yet. I could figure it out. I always did. But frustration simmered beneath the surface. I was already on edge, and the last thing I needed was for the RV to start malfunctioning. I grabbed my toolkit and went outside, working on the generator for what felt like hours. As I crouched next to the RV, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, wrench in hand, listening. There it was again, soft, slow steps like someone was circling me. I whipped around, but the forest was empty. Just the same dense pines, standing silent, watching. "Get it together, Jack," I muttered, turning back to the generator. By dusk, I was back inside. The generator was still dead, and the RV was cold, but I told myself it was fine. I'd built a fire outside, so I didn't need heat in here. I sat by the fire again, staring out into the forest, hoping the flames would chase away the anxiety that had been building all day. That's when I saw them. Shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. They were tall, thin, humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too elongated, too stiff. They stood between the trees, unmoving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but they didn't disappear. They were still there, standing in the shadows just beyond the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. The figures remained still, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I stood up slowly, grabbing the flashlight and shining it toward them, but the beam seemed to bounce off the darkness, unable to penetrate the trees. When I lowered the light, they were gone. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I paced the small space, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone followed me out here? Were they messing with me? I grabbed my phone, only to find the battery drained, dead. The same with my watch. I was completely cut off. I tried to calm myself down, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I felt like I was being watched, even inside the RV. I peeked out the window, expecting to see those figures again, but the clearing was empty. The fire outside was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I crawled into bed, wrapping myself in blankets to ward off the chill that had settled in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was jumping at shadows because of the divorce, because of the loneliness. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with strange voices, whispers that sounded like my ex-wife, but hollow, distorted. She called to me from the darkness, telling me to come outside, to follow her into the trees. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It was morning, but the RV was still freezing. I could see my breath fogging in the air. I had to leave. Something was wrong here, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I threw my things together, ready to get the hell out of the Black Hills, but when I tried the engine, the RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, it sputtered and died. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, panic rising in my chest. Grabbing my bag, I rushed outside, but as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. They were back. The figures, tall, hollow-eyed shadows, stood at the tree line surrounding the clearing. Dozens of them now, all watching me, waiting. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The fire had burned out during the night, and the clearing was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. I had to get out of here. The figures didn't move as I grabbed my camping knife and marched toward the nearest tree, determined to hack my way out of this nightmare. I had seen strange carvings on some of the trees, symbols, jagged and twisted. Maybe they had something to do with this, something to do with the figures. With trembling hands, I drove the blade into the bark, carving through the strange lines. As soon as I broke the symbol, the air shifted. The shadows flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard a low, echoing wail. I didn't stop. I hacked at the trees, cutting through every symbol I could find. The voices in my head grew louder with each slash. My ex-wife's voice, distorted and hollow, begged me to stop, telling me to come into the forest, to let go. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. Finally, when I had cut through the last symbol, the air went still. The figures at the tree line melted away, dissolving into the fog. I stumbled back to the RV, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The engine roared to life on the first try. I sped out of the clearing, not daring to look back. The Black Hills vanished behind me, swallowed by the fog. But even now, as I write this, I can still feel them watching, waiting. The hollow ones never really let you go. I should have known something was wrong the second I stepped out of the RV. The forest around me felt too still, the kind of stillness that makes you question whether the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I brushed it off. I was in the middle of the Sawtooth National Forest, miles from any other campers or hikers. This was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. This place was going to make for the perfect series on my channel. Unmarked trails. I'd call it a deep dive into forgotten paths, places people were too afraid to explore. And this one, it had all the elements of a viral video. No one knew much about the unmarked trail I was hunting, only vague rumors of hikers disappearing and whispered stories of something called the Collector. Something about that name intrigued me. I wasn't one to believe in folklore or ghost stories, but my audience loved them, and that's what mattered. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I hiked, filmed B-roll footage, and narrated into my camera about the history of the area. The trail I was following wasn't exactly easy to find. I had to rely on a few tips from locals, a vague map sketched by a guide at a general store, and a lot of guesswork. But I found it. An overgrown path cutting into the forest, almost hidden by the surrounding brush. Perfect. This is it, I said into the camera, feeling the excitement bubble up. The forgotten trail. I spent that afternoon hiking along it, deeper into the wilderness than I'd planned. Time got away from me, but the sun was still up, casting golden light through the canopy. I knew I had to head back to camp soon, but the trail kept pulling me further. I wanted more footage, more content for the channel. By the time I returned to my RV, dusk was settling in. I set my gear down, sat by the fire I'd built earlier, and reviewed the footage. That's when I noticed it. In the background of one of my shots, there was something. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there, a tall, shadowy outline watching me. I rewound the clip and zoomed in, but when I played it back again, the figure was gone. Just trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'd been alone all day, hadn't I? It's nothing, I muttered to myself, shaking off the creeping unease. Probably a glitch in the camera, some kind of light distortion. I'd seen that before. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up in bed, ears straining, heart pounding. But the forest was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, that feeling, the gnawing sensation of being watched, clung to me, even as the fire burned down to embers outside. The next morning, I pushed my nerves aside and geared up again. Today was the day I was going to push deeper into the trail. I was determined to find something, anything, that could give my channel the edge I was looking for. I packed my camera, drone, and enough supplies to last until nightfall. As I set off, something felt different. The forest had taken on an oppressive quality. The air was heavier, the light dimmer. The trail seemed to have changed too. The trees grew closer together, the undergrowth thicker. Landmarks I thought I had passed before were suddenly missing, or maybe I had misremembered them. Either way, I felt more disoriented than I cared to admit. But I pressed on. Several hours into the hike, my camera started malfunctioning. The battery, fully charged that morning, drained rapidly. The drone refused to take off. When I checked the footage I had shot, static filled the screen, blurring everything. My frustration grew, but I wasn't about to quit. Not yet. That's when I saw it again. Ahead on the trail, the figure. It stood between two trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to feel its presence. Tall, impossibly tall, and still. My breath hitched as I fumbled for the camera, but by the time I raised it, the figure had vanished again. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing. What the hell was that? I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone or something out there. But there was no sign of anyone now. No footprints, no rustling leaves, just silence. I should have turned back then. I should have packed up and left. But something deeper than curiosity kept me going. Pride, maybe ego, the need to prove to myself that I wasn't just a YouTuber chasing shadows. I was a professional. I knew these woods. I pressed on, my mind racing with thoughts of how this footage, real or not, could be my breakthrough. I could see the thumbnails, the titles, the cursed collector trail. Capture it would go viral. Guaranteed. But as the hours dragged on, the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure how far I had gone anymore. The sun, which should have been high in the sky, seemed to hang low, casting long shadows earlier than it should have. And then I heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the dirt. But the deeper I went, the clearer they became. Voices, indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped, straining to listen. My heart thudded in my chest. Ryan. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but hearing my name sent a cold shiver down my spine. I spun around, scanning the forest, but there was no one, just trees. And then there it was again, the figure, closer this time. It stood in the shadows, tall and unmoving, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath quickening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. Ryan. The voice was clearer now, coming from the figure. My legs felt heavy, frozen in place as I stared, unable to look away. It didn't move, didn't approach. It just stood there, watching. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking, but when I hit record, the screen flickered and went black. The battery was dead again. My phone too, completely drained, though it had been fully charged that morning. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted down the trail, my feet pounding the dirt. But no matter how far I ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape twisted around me, trails splitting off in directions I hadn't seen before, paths looping back on themselves. I was trapped. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, my head spinning. The whispers hadn't stopped. They circled around me now, growing louder, more insistent. Come deeper. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding my mind. I wasn't going to let this happen. I'd survived worse. I just needed to think, to get my bearings. But then I saw it, my camp, the RV. I stumbled forward, relief flooding through me as I reached the clearing. But something was wrong. The RV looked different, older, like it had been sitting there for years, weathered and decaying. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had only been gone a day, 2 at most. But the way the RV sagged, its windows cracked, and the rust that ate away at the metal, it felt like I'd been gone much longer. Ryan. The voice was right behind me. I turned, and there it was, the collector. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its shadow stretching toward me, its eyes glowing brighter now, like embers in the dark. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Ryan, come with me. The collector's voice was a low whisper, soft and inviting, pulling at me, urging me to follow. It took a step forward, and I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, as though the very air around me had thickened. No, I choked out, my voice barely audible. The collector's eyes burned into me, its shadow growing longer, reaching out. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the paralysis that gripped me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted into the trees, away from the RV, away from the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until they became a roar. But I kept running, pushing through the exhaustion, the fear, the disorientation. I didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and when I finally did, I realized I had made it out. The forest lay still behind me, the whispers were gone, and the collector was nowhere in sight. I was alive, but I didn't feel relief, only emptiness. I left the Sawtooth National Forest that day, my RV abandoned where the forest had claimed it. I never posted the footage. There was nothing to show anyway, just static shadows and whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the collector calling my name, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest, not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. Gifford-Pinot National Forest had been Karen's idea years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then. Too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now, it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street. Just like that, she was gone, and I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything, that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV, the cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just as I had the past few nights, and sat there watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I had met the day before. Edgar. He had been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, his eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he had said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I had asked, brushing it off. "Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets." I hadn't known what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he had said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I didn't know how far I had walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, as if it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals. Spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity pulling at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air felt heavier, colder. The wind had fallen silent and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, my heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation. It was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoorswoman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They had seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone, or something, was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. Yet the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no response. Instead, the footsteps stopped, dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door, when I saw it, movement at the edge of the trees, a figure, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was happening? I sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. It didn't make sense. People didn't just vanish like that, not without a trace. I thought about Edgar, about the stories he'd told. The Forgotten One, he had called it. A legend about a man who had wandered too far into the forest, losing himself until he became part of the land itself. Now, they said he lured others to join him, preying on their grief, their loneliness, until they disappeared too. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But Leah was gone, and the symbols were still there, etched into the trees like a warning or an invitation. The footsteps returned that night, and this time I knew what they wanted. I could hear her voice, Karen's voice, calling to me from the trees. Soft, loving, like she was right there waiting for me. "Derek," she whispered, "come find me." My heart ached, torn between the impossible and the undeniable. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it, but I wanted to believe it was. I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin. The forest was dark, silent, but the voice was there, guiding me. I walked toward the trees, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Derek," she called again. "Don't leave me." I stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. I could see her now, just beyond the first row of trees, her face, her smile. She was there, waiting for me, but something was wrong. The shadows around her shifted, twisting like they were alive. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were hollow, empty. I took a step back, the spell breaking. This wasn't Karen. I turned and ran back to the RV, back to safety. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in as the voice grew louder, angrier. "Derek!" I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear her screaming my name from the trees, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left Fort Pino the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. And whatever was out there, whatever the Forgotten One truly was, it would stay there waiting for someone else. I always thought the vastness of the desert would calm me. It was exactly what I needed after everything that had happened at work. The constant pressure, the unrelenting deadlines, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in the same routine. I had planned this trip to Big Bend National Park months ago, thinking a week away from it all would clear my head. Solitude in the desert seemed like the perfect way to hit the reset button. I'd heard the stories, of course, rumors of spiritual significance, whispered legends passed down by native tribes, but I had never put much stock in that kind of thing. They were just stories, right? I was wrong. Big Bend is a place where the land meets the sky in such a dramatic way that it's almost unnerving. The sun bakes the earth by day, and at night the stars stretch endlessly, a canopy of light over the barren landscape. The silence is absolute, and out here, far from everything, it feels like the world is holding its breath. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the distant Chisos Mountains. My plan was simple. Hike the trail to the window, a spot famous for its breathtaking sunset views. I'd set up camp, spend the night there, and continue deeper into the wilderness the next day. A week alone, away from the noise of civilization, I had been craving this. At first, everything seemed perfect. The air was dry and warm, the trail rugged but manageable, and my gear was top-notch, a mix of high-end camping equipment and essentials I had collected over the years. I felt prepared, confident, ready to let the desert cleanse my mind. But that feeling didn't last. By the time I reached my campsite, I noticed my GPS flickering, the signal coming and going without explanation. I chalked it up to a glitch. Maybe the battery was low, though I had checked it before I left. Then my phone started acting strangely. The battery, which had been at 80% when I arrived, drained rapidly, dropping to 20% in just a few minutes. No big deal, I thought. I wasn't here to use my phone. After all, this was supposed to be my escape from technology. As I set up my tent, the sun dipped below the horizon and a cold wind swept through the canyon. I hadn't expected the temperature to drop so quickly, and I fumbled through my pack for my jacket. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. That's when I heard it, the first sign that something wasn't right. At first, it was faint, just a whisper carried on the wind, so soft I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, rhythmic, almost like chanting, echoing through the canyon. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing, just the wind. "Get it together, Tyler," I muttered to myself. I was overthinking things again. The wind through the rocks, that's all it was. My mind playing tricks on me, feeding into my anxieties like it always did. I finished setting up camp and tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the desert itself was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, exhausted, really. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something real. The whispers grew, surrounding me, coming from every direction. They weren't in English, not even Spanish. It was an ancient language, guttural and rhythmic, like a chant I couldn't understand. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I reached for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam sputtered and died. My hands fumbled in the darkness, searching for my backup lantern. When I found it, I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light, but the whispers didn't stop. They only seemed to get closer. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just anxiety. Something was out there. I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fire I had built earlier had long since died down to embers. I looked around, scanning the landscape with my lantern. That's when I saw them. The small stone cairns, dozens of them, scattered around the edges of my campsite like tiny tombstones. They hadn't been there when I set up camp, I was sure of it. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here. Or something. My mind raced. Could it have been other hikers? A prank, maybe. But the trail had been empty when I arrived, and this was an isolated spot. No one would have come this far just to mess with me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I backed toward my tent, the beam of my lantern swinging wildly across the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, darting between the rocks. It was too fast to be human. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the lantern around, trying to catch another glimpse, but there was nothing, just the empty desert. I bolted back into my tent, zipping it shut behind me, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I sat there, gripping the lantern, listening as the whispers faded into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made my heart jump. Every gust of wind felt like something moving just outside. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the unease lingered. I packed up camp, deciding to cut my trip short. I'd head back to the trailhead, call it a failure, and go home. There was no shame in that. But as I started hiking back, something was off. The trail didn't look right. The landmarks, the rock formations, they weren't where they should have been. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but nothing matched. It was like the land itself had shifted overnight. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, dead. My phone, too, had lost all power. Panic set in. I was lost, completely, utterly lost, in the middle of the desert. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. I could find my way back. I just retraced my steps. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape seemed to warp around me, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. My footprints, which should have been visible in the sand, were gone, erased, as if I had never walked that way at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me, but the cold from the night before hadn't left. It clung to me, seeping into my bones. And then I saw it again. The shadow. It was farther away this time, just a dark figure standing on the ridge, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin. I couldn't make out any features, just its silhouette against the sky. It didn't move, it didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I scrambled over the rocks, my pack bouncing against my back. But no matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, always just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting. My mind raced with the legends I had read before the trip, stories of La Malahora, the evil hour, a spirit that lured travelers to their doom. It was said to appear just before tragedy struck, a warning of death. I hadn't believed in those stories, not really. But now, with the shadow stalking me, I wasn't so sure. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind frayed. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I stopped, turning to look at the ridge behind me. The shadow was closer now, standing still, its dark form blending with the rocks. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not afraid," I said aloud, though my voice wavered. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadow didn't move, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive, weighing down on me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Slowly, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the landscape like smoke. The whispers, too, faded into the wind, growing quieter until they were gone. I stood there for a long time, the desert silent once more. The sky darkened above me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I found the trail. The landscape had returned to normal, the landmarks in the right places, as if nothing had changed. I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs weak, my mind still spinning from the encounter. I left Big Bend that day, never to return. Some people might say it was just my imagination, that the isolation and anxiety had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The desert is a place of mystery, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, and sometimes something crosses over.